Okay. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Okay. All right. So we're a MSP. Was an MSP. Now we just do compliance. And we've worked and done over 250 risk assessments. The most important part of this is the risk assessment, so we understand where a company's at right now and actually how to move them forward. We are certified with the DoD or the AD board as an RPO. An RPO is a readiness company. And let me explain how that all works. And my slides aren't moving, so what is going on here? Hold on. And my slides are moving great. Hold on. Please stand by. I have to pull back up 1 second. So these are different, well, all right, I think we're okay now. So these are different, the 20 different compliances that we do, from HIPAA to NIST 800-171, et cetera. So we're certified RPOs with the DoD and the AV board, and we're a readiness company. So to really understand exactly how it works is the Cyber AB is the certification body. They're an accreditation body. And there's really two types of companies. There's RPOs, which are the kind of the readiness companies. You get companies ready for CMMC. And then there's a 3CPAO company, which is the auditor or the assessor. Now, under the RPO, there's something called RPs, and they're the individuals that actually do the compliance work. And that's what we do. We get a companies ready. We have worked with 70, 80 companies, helping them get ready, and just learned a tremendous amount, which I want to share with you today to show you how you can do these things kind of practically and affordably. Now, once everything's ready, then you bring in what's called an assessor, and the assessor actually does the review of all the work that's done and would actually issue the certification. You can't be both. You can either be a readiness company or you can be the 3CPAO, because you have to have what's called a separation where the fox can't watch the henhouse. So when you look at the CMMC, there's 3 levels. And one of the first things that happens when I meet with a client is they're basically saying, what level am I? So sometimes they tell me they're level 1, and after we do our assessment, we find out they're level 2. Or sometimes they, basically tell us they're level 2, and we say, you know what, you're really level 1. One of the reasons it's so difficult is because the documents for CUI, which fall into level 2, are really marked by the government. And it's very difficult to look at how and where these documents are marked. So today we run what's called a scanner, and the scanner scans for CUI at your office. And now I can tell where the CUI is, where the CUI isn't, if it's just FCI data. So now we have really good visibility into the data at rest and motion. And by having really good visibility into data rest and motion, then we can clearly say you're level 1, 2, or 3 up front. So today we're really concerned about level 1 and level 2. And in the future, which we'll talk about, there'll also be an opportunities for level 3, which will have little higher standards. But the first step you always got to do is really figure out what level you are and what compliance needs to be done. So as you know, the CMMC certification has been phased in over time. And as of Monday this week, which was November 10th, it's now enforced. So what you're going to see is that all contracts going forward are going to be actually having a CMMC clause in there. And then I'm going to show you exactly how it's going to be phased out over time. So the phase in is going to be in 4 phases. This is really important because now that everyone has to basically be all the contracts off CMMC in it, most of the contracts in the first year will be under phase 1, which will be a self-assessment. The self-assessment is against the 110 controls and 320 assessment objectives. So if you look at control one, there's like an A, B, C, and D, right? If you add them up, there's 320 assessment objectives. And that is a lot of work to do to get all these assessment controls in place. But the litmus test for a self-assessment is much different than an audit. Now, some of the contracts, and we don't know which ones, during the first year may have an actual CMMC 2.0 certification clause in there, which means that if it's self-assessment, nobody's really, your score is kind of like your honor system, but if there's a certification that's involved, it's much more standard where that assessor has to come in and provide the certification. So in phase one, most of it will be self-assessment, maybe some CMMC 2.0 certifications. You have to look at your documents and your RFQs and RFPs just to see what is required on each one. Now in phase two, which will happen in 2026, most organizations will need to have what's called a level 2 certification, and not to bid on contracts, but in order to be receiving a contract. So you can bid on a contract without the certification if it has it in the contract, level 2 certification, but in order to receive the contract, then you would have to have a level 2 certification. They'll also be implementing what's called the level 3 for higher requirements around more sensitive data or more secure CUI. The controls won't be a 110, they'll actually be the NIST 171 would actually move to what's called the NIST 800-172, which are some more controls, more specifically to address sensitive data. And then as we get into phase 3, which would be kind of after 11/10/2027, all DoD contracts will level 2 or level 3 would have to have 3 CMMC 2.0 certification. So they're giving you a chance over time to kind of step things up before everything kind of goes to certification. And then in phase 4, everything level 1, 2, and 3 will be required. Now I could tell you, after doing probably 70 assessments for companies and working with a lot of companies, I've only seen 2 level 1s. And a level 1 usually falls into something called like a COTS, where it's commercial off the shelf, and it's just kind of a generic product that you're selling. Most customers and clients that I do work for and have done all the scans and the research mostly fall under level 2. And the reason is that they're storing, transmitting, or processing CUI. And that's really the litmus test for a level 2. So we have a process, and it's worked out pretty well. It's called Assess, Address, and Maintain, and we now have a worldwide service mark on it. And what we've understand is if we do a really, really good job on the risk assessment, and that's really the first requirement for CMMC, we can uncover a baseline and really understand where a customer's at today. Then once we actually understand where a customer's at today, then we can build out kind of a high-level POAM and kind of create a SPRS score. The SPRS score right now is a self-assessment, but you got to make sure that it's right, because if it's not, you can fall under what's called a False Claims Act. Now, the highest score is 110, and that's what you want to be looking for, and the lowest score is a negative 206. So there's really no rule as to what you can submit on the actual score. But I would tell you that if a contract officer sees something in the negative territory, I mean, he could hold that against you in getting a contract. So what I tell our clients is that, look, you don't have to have a 110 or 100% right now under the first year, but you want to have at least a C plus or B average. You want to get at least a plus 40, plus 50, plus 60, and have some kind of a decent C plus B average. And I think that'll suffice to get contracts. You don't want to go in there with a big negative score because I'm pretty sure it's going to be held against you. So it's very important. And again, as you work on in your improvements, we can change the score on a monthly basis. So a lot of times what we'll do for clients is we'll do a risk assessment, and then we'll see they have, like, let's say a negative score. The scoring is 5s, 3s, and 1s. So some controls that you have in place are 5s, some are 3s, and some are 1s. So what I'll do is we'll actually create a plan that we actually go after the 5s first to get the score up as quick as we can, because we want to always present this in a favorable manner and get that score up as fast as we can. Now, once we lay everything out, then there's a lot of decisions to be made. I'm going to show you how we go through making those decisions, but then you have to build out the whole POAM, and you have to build out the SSP. The SSP is a system security plan. And when we first started doing our first couple of audits, we turned in SSPs that were 90 to 100 pages long, and they got rejected. Right, boom, got rejected. The SSP, believe it or not, is every control with every sub-control, and all the documentation that has to do with all the evidence. And those documents are somewhere upward of 150, 200 pages now. So there's an enormous amount of work that has to be done in preparation before you go into an audit. So we do the assessment. Once we do the assessment, we address it, get all the controls, documentation, policies, procedures in place. And then, not realizing it, but what we figured out is once companies become compliant, there's things to do on a regular basis to maintain compliance. There's tabletop exercises, there's onboarding, offboarding, there's quite a few things that have to be done on a regular basis. If not, you can like unravel like a rope and become uncompliant pretty quickly. So when you look at compliance, the compliance is really broken down in 3 components. And it's good to look at it this way. There's an administrative component, there's a technical component, and then there's a physical component. Now, when I work with a lot of companies and managed service providers around the country and whatnot, everybody thinks that the CMMC is really a technical exercise. And yes, there's technical components to it, but I can tell you that it's really an administrative exercise. You have to build like 20 policies and procedures around incident response, disaster recovery, business continuity. We just can't write the policy, right? You have to figure all these things out, how companies are running, before you can actually put these in place. It's about building procedures. It's about collecting evidence and project management and documentation of proof. It's a very, very big exercise in documentation or the administrative controls. And that's where I think a lot of companies don't realize it, and they bring an auditor in too soon and they wind up failing. So we'll talk about that as well. So what you want to do is make sure that you have the right resources in place to make sure the physical controls are in place, which aren't a lot of them, but things like visitor management or card access, at your facilities are in place. Then all the technical controls that's really the encryption, the log monitoring, all the technical data components you have to have in place around your network, and then the big administrative piece. So when we do risk assessments, we really have to break down. And one of the key things we do that most companies don't do is we actually do a CUI flow analysis. And that's really done with scans that can actually scan the CUI at rest in motion. And there's also some manual mapping that we have to do and ask a lot of questions. The first thing it has to be done right, and it's very important, is get that CUI workflow down. Why is it so important? The reason is that these CMMC compliances can be very expensive. But what you want to do is hire a company that understands kind of like how you work and your technology, because if we can reduce the scope down to what's called an enclave or a subset of users into a network. So let me give you an example. Working with a company right now that was told they had to have their whole company certified. So there's 150 users, 4 locations. They do some commercial, they do some DoD work, and they were told they need a certification for the whole company. After coming in and doing an assessment, we really realized only 20 people out of the 150 actually store, transmit, or process CUI on a regular basis. So when you do the risk assessment, we'll do the risk assessment for the whole company, right? But then when we do the scope for the audit component, we were able to scope it down to 20 users. So when the auditor comes in, they're only auditing against 20 users and not against the whole company. And we understood we could do these enclaves for a number of years, but the more we get into it, the more we realize more and more companies actually fall under a situation where they can do an enclave. And I can tell you, we're saving tens of thousands of dollars by doing that for companies, because the enclave, if you can do it, does save a whole lot of money. A lot of companies already have policies and procedures, disaster recovery, or business continuity. They might have an ISO 27001. We'll take all the information a company has now and we'll gather it. Their network diagrams. Any other, you might have a ISO 9000, you might have other compliances. We'll pull all that data and then we do a really good job of that discovery. Now, the discovery takes some time. It takes about 60 days to do a really good risk assessment. And once we do the risk assessment, then we have to start figuring out what tools are in place and what tools need to go in place. And we spend a lot of time helping companies figuring out what layers they have. So, for example, if we find that CUI is being stored in the cloud, well, guess what? If it's in the cloud, they're going to need FedRAMP, right? So things have to be FedRAMP authorized or FedRAMP equivalent in order to store data into the cloud. Now, there's a lot of pros and cons, but what we're finding out right now is that there's two types of FedRAMP certifications. One is authorized, and that goes through the ATO process. And there was such a bottleneck of companies trying to get through that they opened up something called the FedRAMP equivalent. The FedRAMP equivalent is having all the FedRAMP controls, the 280 controls in place, and then a 3PAO would come in and do the assessment. So this opened up the options for you as a company to be able to use a lot more companies in their stack, or technologies you can use, like Box is authorized, Prevail is equivalent. Kiteworks is authorized. So some companies are authorized, some are equivalent. If it's equivalent, we have to do more documentation and show share matrix. If it's authorized, it kind of goes right through the process. So not only do we do an assessment and select all the products and services, then we have to figure out how to document everything in preparation for the auditor. So when you do the CMMC readiness, there's a lot of requirements that have to be done around. So we have to get our clients ready. Like, so for your systems, we have to get you ready as a client with 110 controls and 320 assessment objectives. But guess what? We also have to get, if you're using an outsourced MSP, which a lot of companies do, they use outsourced IT companies. Guess what? If your MSP isn't CMMC certified, which probably 0.5% of the country are, then what you have to do is we have to build a shared matrix. And the shared matrix is we have to show the controls that your managed service provider is doing against what you're doing. So for example, if they're doing your backups, we have to show in a shared matrix what the MSP is doing and what you're doing as a company. And I've been called into audits that have failed, not because the client wasn't ready, because the MSP didn't have the right shared matrix documentation in place. These are some of the situations that we're seeing right now, that it's not just you as a client have to have all this ready. The MSP also has to be ready. And there's a third component. All the vendors and products and services that we picked out back here in the layers, guess what? We have to have what's called a shared matrix for every one of those companies, right? So there's a lot of work to be done. Now, most of these companies are creating them, and if they don't, they can't be used. So we have to make sure when we do our assessments that not only do we have all the controls mapped out right for your business, not only do we have to make sure that your MSP has everything in place and has a shared matrix, but we got to make sure your MSP or the the actual layers of security that you're putting in place have to be in place and actually document it. And then when the auditor comes in, it's like a trifecta. It's 1, 2, 3. If any one of them aren't right, guess what? The auditor rejects it, and you can actually file the assessment. So these are things to consider when you're actually getting prepared. So now once we make a selection and we figure out the MSP, we figure out all the vendors and layers of security you're going to have, and we understand your workflow and how disaster recovery might work or how incident response would work, all this workflow has to be worked out. And a lot of times what's happening is we got to spend time helping companies actually change their workflow because their workflow is not right. And we know in anticipation of an audit, we may have to change some workflow practices and then get that in place first. So once everything's in place, then we can go ahead and write all the policies and procedures that have to be done. So the access control is a policy that is how everybody accessing the information with security behind it, all the way down to audit and accountability. So you can't write policies till everything else has been mapped out and kind of sorted through. Now, once these policies and procedures are in place, guess what? You have to show the auditor that they're actually not just policies and procedures that are on the shelf and you dust them off when the auditor comes. You have to show that they actually are in place and they're actually working. Now, most auditors want to see about a 90-day timeline that you can show that the policies and procedures are actually implemented and are in place. Now, some auditors are a little bit more lenient on that, but for the most part, the standard is about 90 days. When we do SOC audits and other types of audits, I mean, you could have it as much as a year. You have to show that the controls are in place. But in CMMC, they're really asking for just about a 90-day. So now, once we get a client ready, the first thing we have to do is get the risk 110 control. So we set up a portal. Portal is called TrueOps, and we also use something called Monday.com. And we build a project management, and we document all 110 controls and 320 assessment objectives. So we have to have a piece of evidence for every single one of the 320 controls. It is a lot of work printing out reports, making sure if people are, they're training reports, everybody's been trained. And there's three types of evidence. One is a report. It could be a print screen, or it could be actually an interview. So you got to make sure that you have at least one piece of evidence for every single sub-control. And then you got to get the scores up. Now, once you get the score up, it's important to keep pushing that score up every month, or as soon as you get some progress with points, I'd recommend trying to update that score every couple of weeks on the self-assessment basis, as close to 110 as you can, as fast as you can, because that's going to help you look favorable with the contract officer. Now, the plan of actions and milestones, that is the plan by control for the controls that are in place. So when we work with a company now, they're all different phases. Some people are just starting. It's very rare. Some people are 20% into it. Some people are 90% into it and call us in. So the plan of actions and milestone is the plan you put together for the missing controls and the missing controls only. So let's say, for example, they don't have auditing and logging. In the POAM, you put implementing logging, auditing and logging, and you would say, I'm implementing it in 90 days, and here's the product and service, and you specify how you're doing it. So that's the actual POAM. And when you go into the SPRS site, it actually asks you a POAM date, and now it also asks you your CMMC date. So it asks you for these dates, but not for the specific information. So that POAM has to be clearly laid out of how you're going to get to the 110 controls. And then the SSP is the big doc, and that's the document that is created that can be upward of 200 pages long. And that's the first thing that we hand to the actual auditor. So when the auditor comes in, the first thing we do is hand them the SSP. And the more detailed and the more it's laid out and the more it's planned, the faster the auditor can get through it and the faster the certification. So I don't want to make light of this SSP. The SSP is one daunting document. It takes a lot of time to do. So, people don't realize it, but I've had, the shortest I think we've gotten a customer ready for CMMC is probably 6 months, and it could take upward of a year. So if you look here, it's 153 components. It's 6 pages long. This is the table of contents for the SSP. So it is a daunting document. If everybody tells you anything different, it's a lot of work. And this is what we do for our clients. So we're actually the company that does the services. We do the lion's share of the work. 85% of the work is done by us. 15%, you'll need to do some work, and the technical people need to do some work. But there's an enormous amount of administrative documentation that needs to be done. So I just want to touch on a couple of points here that you need to consider. Now, one of the things that you have to know is there's something called ESPs. An ESP is an external service provider. It can be anybody that you're working with that's providing external IT services. Could be your MSP, could be an MSSP. If you have a software company that's doing your CAD drawing, Rivet or whatever support, the list goes on and on. But there's parameters for ESPs, and these ESPs have to have what's called a shared matrix, and that's part of what the shared matrix we talked about. There's also another provision for what's called cloud vendors, and cloud vendors, if they, as again, store CUI, they need to be FedRAMP, or they actually, if they don't, then they they can also have a shared matrix, right? You don't have to be certified. So that's important to know as well. We help you decipher which is which. We get in these situations all the time, like going back to what version of Microsoft should I get? Should I get GCC High? Well, GCC High is like a blunt instrument. It's very expensive, and it can cause a whole lot of problems communicating with other companies. So if you put in GCC High, A, it's the whole company. It doesn't really lend itself to an enclave. B, I have people calling me up over the country saying, I can't work with this GCC High and communicate with my customers and internally. So you really have to think through these layers that you put in place. For Microsoft alone, the conversations, do you do GCC High? Do I do the Gov Cloud? Or do I just do commercial with like an enclave and a Prevail or something? So we get these questions all day long. And the answer is each customer is a little bit different. And if you hire somebody that really understands the ins and outs of these different programs, you're going to save a boatload of money, because we're only going to put the things in place that you need, and we're not going to go after these very expensive products that's like a blunt instrument. So that's something that really, you think about. And again, what we do for our clients is we'll lay out 3 different options and we'll price them out. But, sometimes if you have ITAR on top of a CMMC, top ITAR as well, as you know, ITAR State Department, but it has to be all U.S. citizens. So if you have ITAR, which a lot of our clients have on their contracts, then you may have to use a little different solution like a GCC High or whatever to maintain that. So in the beginning, if you had ITAR, it wasn't really part of the audit. But what we learned is that if you do have ITAR or any other requirements inside the DoD contract, that can the assessor can assess against that. So it's pretty interesting to know as well. So the shared matrix is something that we touched on, and if you do use any third parties, it's very important to make sure you get all your shared matrix built out. I got called into several clients right now that thought the auditor came in and then had to stop the audit because either the tools that they were using didn't have the shared matrix, or the MSP wasn't ready. So I'll give you an example. We have called into a situation, auditor is in the middle of it, and they were using at the time Kaseya, and Kaseya for patch management and whatnot. They didn't have their shared matrix in place. We were called in. I got on the horn to the top level people at Kaseya, they were getting it done. It wasn't done yet. They had to wait a couple months. Auditor had to come back. It was very difficult getting them rescheduled. So you really got to think about all the components up front that have to be done before that audit's ever considered. And I can tell you out there, there's a lot of auditors out there that are kind of aggressive and having companies sign up and getting deposits. And you do not, absolutely do not, and I'll repeat this, do not want to get any auditor into your company unless you are 1,000% ready. And the reason is if you don't get an 80% or better, guess what? You fail. And if you fail, you could have to pay for audits again. The second thing we're finding is that the audit prices are all over the board. So what we do now for our clients is when we are starting to get ready about 2 months out, we'll actually shop auditors. So I'll go out and shop 3 auditors, and I just did one for a client. I got a $30,000 price, a $45,000 price, and a $65,000 price. And the truth was, all 3 would do a good job. So I advised on using the $30,000 auditor. They did a great job, by the way. So knowing who to shop and how to shop these auditors is very important. The second thing is what we're finding is because we've done so many SOC audits and ISO audits and audits in other areas, we've been doing audits for almost 10 years. So most companies don't have any experience with auditors and they're bringing them in too early. And it's just a self-inflicted wound. There's an art, and I would call it an art, of when to bring an auditor in. So what happens is you really have to time it because these auditors are all scheduling out. So for example, if I know a customer's 80% ready and it's now November, I might schedule them for March because I have to kind of project when that audit's ready. If I have him come in too early, guess what? You don't get 80%, you fail, or he has to come back. And then he says, you know what, I'm booked for a year. So it's really an art scheduling these audits. And what we do for our clients is we do kind of A to Z. We start with the assessment. We help them with the implementation. We help them with documentation, shopping the auditor. And even when the audits are happening, we actually hold our clients' hands through the audit process. So I'm getting quite a few calls of just auditors coming in kind of too soon. I don't think they meant to do it. They're coming in too soon, writing contracts and being a little aggressive. And what's happening is it's causing a lot of angst for companies across the country. So you want to make sure that somebody's advising you as to when to bring the auditor in, making sure you're not overpaying. Now, the audits are 3 years. So once you get your certification, you're certified for 3 years, but there are some things that need to be done. So we can help, clients kind of maintain their compliance to make sure they don't fall out of compliance. So that's pretty much the presentation, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. I'm sure you have quite a few questions.
Steve, that was great. Thank you. We do have several questions in the chat. I don't know if you're able to see them or we can go ahead and
Yep, I got
read them. Okay. Yeah, if you want to go kind of write down, but I can also, we can read them to you as well.
Okay, hold on for a second. Let me make sure I get it. Okay. Okay, the first question is about the scanning tool. So the scanning tool is something that we incorporate as part of our risk assessment. The STIG viewer looks at the NIST controls, which does the STIG. This actually looks at the data. So we're actually scanning data at rest and motion. So if you bring us into a risk assessment, we can do the scanning for you, but that'll pull the CUI data. I usually like to let the scanners run for about a month so we can see kind of over time where the data is at rest and motion. We can actually see it by application now as well. So, we can see if you have CUI going to certain cloud vendors, that tells us it needs to be, let's say, FedRAMP. Next question. If our CUI is housed in within a skiff, or another company would, our company fall under their CMMC umbrella, or will we need to our own 3 CPAO? So there, the question, let me just read this one more time. I'd have to dig a little bit deeper into that, but at first glance, I would think that whoever is the owner of the CUI would be your audit, right? So let's say these are your CAD drawings and you're storing them somewhere else or with another company. If they're your drawings, they would fall under your preview, and it's probably a separate audit for your company, a separate audit for their company. But I'd have to dig a little deeper, but sometimes that's why you do an assessment, so you can really understand the flow. And then once I understand that, I could tell you, how it actually works. Let's see. Will contract awards be able to be challenged or protested based on awardee CMMC self-assessment? This scenario could arise where a competitor doesn't behave honestly when self-assessing and their costs are lower than the folks who strive for accuracy. How do the KOs ensure that these self-assessments are done correctly? Good question. So the reason the whole CMMC is making everybody certified is because now you're on a level playing field, right? So that was the big problem. People were saying they're self-assessed, and there was a lot of dishonesty going on. And I actually been caught into situations where there's been some fines and had to do some cleanup work. So I think there's very little you can do against the self-assessment phase. But I think once everybody gets to see the CMMC 2.0 certifications, then I think you're on a level playing field. But having said that, you could, challenge and ask for a contract officer to look at somebody's SSP. Just because you didn't get your CMMC certification doesn't mean you're not supposed to have all the documentation in place. So if they don't have all 20 policies and procedures, and they don't have a full 200-page CSSP, I would think you could probably challenge them. It's a good way to challenge them.
Hey, Steve, before you go too far, I think there was one little question above that one of how long are POAMs good for before re-audit? You might have mentioned that in there, but is there are POAMs good for a certain amount of time before they have to get re-audited?
Yeah, so the POAM is good for a year. So if you have a POAM in place, and it should be good for a year. Now, remember, you're supposed to have an annual risk assessment. So if you have an annual risk assessment, that's going to change your POAM. But they should be good for a whole year. Next question. Is there a place similar to FedRAMP Marketplace to check if an organization is CMMC NIST 800-171 assessed? I don't think there is. There's no database that I know of right now that shows what companies have the CMMC certifications in place or who's been assessed. So that's a really good question. It's probably something you can develop. But I think there's 300 assessors, and they plan on doing several thousand this year. So, but I don't know of any database that tracks it. The other thing about FedRAMP is FedRAMP shows the authorized companies, but it doesn't show the equivalent companies. There's a whole new layer and line of companies that are equivalent, like even Prevail, that there's no database for that either. So a lot of this is just us doing the work every day and doing the research. We're actually putting a database together of vendors and the shared matrix. That'll be done in a couple of weeks, but there's several hundred, like Kaseya and Ninja. Ninja's a FedRAMP product. They're coming on board, almost on a daily basis.
And Steve, you can't, right? Because obviously all those scores go into SPURS. I call it SPURS, SPRS, right? You couldn't, there's no way, kind of like SAM.gov, where you can see some basic information on all the companies. I don't think there's a way in SPURS where you could do that, right? If you were to search for a company in SPURS, I don't think their CMMC score is popping up or their NIST 800 score is popping up.
No, I think it's
Okay.
private inside the DoD.
Yeah, I think so too. Okay.
Yeah, that's a good question. The competitive side of it. Um, I just think, when I walk into a client right now and they say I'm 100% or 85% or 90%, there's some very clear things I can see. One is I ask for the policies. If the policies aren't documented right and really thorough, that's like a red flag. Or if their SSP is under 100 pages. So I don't know how you do this, but if you can get the contract officer or whatever to have them turn in certain things, which are allowed, the contract officers allowed to, under the self-assessment, to ask for this documentation, that would be a red flag if it's, not properly done. That's the only way I know how to do it right now. And I see some more coming in.
Yeah, I think your next one is how do you recommend a small startup afford getting to level 2 compliance approval, which is always a great question.
Yeah, I got a lot of empathy for you. I mean, as from our standpoint, our company, I have to have RPO certifications. I have to have 3 CCP certified. So we're used to paying a lot of money per year for certifications. But most smaller companies I deal with aren't um, used to it. So it's kind of a new line item on your financial statement. And, sometimes that new line item is difficult. So I don't know how small you are, but, if you're really small, it could be expensive to get your CMMC certification. So what I would do is I'd look at the other ways or things you could do that you don't have to do it. So maybe get a level 1 in place. So I'll give you an example. We have a small contractor. We have a construction company that subcontracts to a very small sub. I think there's like 5 employees. So they wanted to get CMMC certified level 2. And when they realized what they had to do, there's like, isn't there any other way? Well, guess what? If your client could basically, set up a couple of Google devices or laptop, and they can give it to a small contractor, and they can view like the drawings of the CUI without that smaller company having to get certified. So there's ways around it, and depending on how you do work, I'd have to look at how you do work. There might be some ways around it. The other things people don't realize is there's something called COTS. So if you're supplying something that's commercial off the shelf, sometimes people don't realize it, but that's where it falls in. All you need is a level 1. So that's a couple ideas of how to get around it. But if you're small, we deal with a lot of small companies, and you want to see if you can get an enclave, right? So the enclave would peel down the size of the audit. There's things you can do there. And then also figuring out your tool stack, trying to get inexpensive tools so you don't have these large monthly expenses around getting compliant. So I'm happy to have a conversation and walk you through different ideas, but there's just a couple of ideas that come to mind.
And Steve, isn't there, I mean, I've seen from Virginia, there's some state level funding that's gotten pushed out for some of this stuff too. I mean, it's obviously very state dependent, but I think you guys are in Maryland. Have you seen anything or have companies been able to use that for you all?
Yeah, so Maryland's has the best
Yeah, that's
program.
what I
It's a
thought.
50%. Maryland has like $2 million in the bucket, and they have a 50% tax credit on cybersecurity. So we've done a couple dozen clients and got them through this process. So basically, it can go against your state tax. So if you spend $50,000 in IT services and you're paying $50,000 in state taxes, you get a 50% refund. And there's a couple other states with small grants that I've seen, but
Yeah.
that's the best program so far. The key
So I
is
think,
bringing in a company that understands that you're small. And I'll give you an example. Like there's a big company out there that you see advertised everywhere. And we just came into a project. We were a quarter of the price because we deal with small, medium-sized companies. So the prices for readiness is over the board and the prices for auditors over the board. My advice is shop.
and Steve, I don't think, so real quick, I think you got to most of the questions, but I'll triple check. But yours and Rich's contact information, is that something you would mind dropping in the chat if people wanted to reach out. And then
Absolutely.
I mentioned it to Rich when he first hopped on, but if you're okay with it, if you send me the presentation, I can push that out to all the attendees and again, include your contact information for anyone who might not have been able to attend, but I think you're gonna get some companies that, yeah, that was a lot of great information. The FedRAMP equivalent, like that's the first time I've heard of that. So I'm definitely interested in learning more about that as FedRAMP, ATO, all that good stuff is becoming more and more important too. But
Yeah.
um
Only putting FedRAMP in on the applications that must have it, because these are
yeah,
very expensive applications.
yes.
I get called in all the time, and I'm like, we don't need FedRAMP for this, this, and this. Like, oh, I didn't realize it. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that's important. And I'll be happy to do a discovery call with anybody just to kind of talk them through and share some ideas if they need it.
No, I appreciate I know you guys are. You guys are great with that. But um again, if anyone has any questions, drop them in there. But I want to bring up our last slide. So really appreciate if you guys could break out your phones and take our quick survey to give us feedback and especially any other topics you guys are interested in. Similarly, if you want to meet with the Mid-Atlantic Tech Bridge, there's that QR code. And then, keep an eye Eventbrite and or LinkedIn to see our upcoming events. But I'm gonna leave that up there and then you see if anything else popped up. Yeah, okay. So I think there's a couple other questions popped up. I see Miles.
Yeah, so the cost for 3 CPAOs,
Yeah.
the lowest cost I just got, and more 3 CPAOs. Well, remember, this 3 CPAO is the actual company, and the company hires assessors, and there's more and more assessors being certified. And as that happens, the prices are going to come down. So the lowest cost I've been able to get a client is $25,000 for a small enclave. I mean, that's kind of the starting point. That's the lowest, and I can help you give you some names of companies if you need it.
And then Steve, kind of up above there, Miles had a question about, this whole idea of 2/3 of your employees could be excluded from an enclave and that whole process. Um, and then he's like, what are those people doing that they aren't handling CUI? I mean, it's very much the nature of the work that they're doing. So they could be like on the admin HR side and not handling CUI. So the enclave that they have is just people touching the CUI. But I mean, if you had a better example or something to add there, I think that'd be great.
Okay. So there's no two companies are alike. So what we do is like I talk about the assessment being so important. So when I walk into I'll give you three that I'm working on right now. One is the first question I'm going to ask is what percent of your business is DoD direct, right? So once you find that out, if it's like less than 50%, then the flag goes up. You may be a candidate for an enclave. So let's say you're 80% commercial, 20% DoD, then you probably opportunity for an enclave. So once you learn that, then you just map the CUI data at rest in motion and then run the scanner and you kind of confirm it. Then you can build the users that you have. I have another client that's all government, but only 50% of their work is DoD. So those users that touch CUI are in scope of that enclave. The other users are not. So that's just two examples.
Yeah, that's good.
Now, the government's starting to roll out the CMMC to other departments. So when you do the assessment, we'll assess the whole company, right, against the NIST controls. But then the enclave for the audit component, which is the most stringent, would be limited just to the enclave. And you have to prove that you have the enclave, which the scans can also do, because we can show that there's no CUI on these other devices.
No, Steve and Rich, as always, I've always enjoyed working with you and I would send companies to you in a heartbeat and really appreciate, you being willing to meet with them and have a discussion before you send them a bill. This is so important on so many levels. And while people, I think, if companies have been kind of putting it off, I mean, it's here. So, and we know it's here to stay. And Right, and whether you're going to prime a contract on your own or you're going to be a subcontractor, like your primes are going to be looking for you to be at least a level one, likely a level two here sooner than later. But
One last
yeah,
thing I'm talking about is think about if you have subcontractors, like some clients we work with have very few subcontractors, but some have a lot of subcontractors. So once that contract has CUI in it, even now with the self-assessment, you want to make sure that they're got their self-assessment or they're on their path to getting the CMMC, or else you're not going to be able to use them. And so what I usually say to companies now is, how many subcontractors do you have? And put them in two buckets. One of the ones you really can't live without, and ones you could probably, shop out very easily. But you have to be very careful because I have several clients, especially in the manufacturing sector, that are very reliant on a couple of subcontractors. They're like, I never thought of that. But it isn't something you can snap your fingers and get done. So you want to think about your subcontractors and giving them a heads up and making sure they're on the right path.
yep, that is a great point. Well, I am going to kind of wrap us up here. But again, if you guys haven't seen Rich and Steve, their contact information is in the chat. I put a direct link to the very quick Google survey, and you will see a follow-up email from us, likely with the slides and at least with their contact information. And thank you for attending. But highly recommend you reach out to Rich and Steve if you have any kind of follow-up questions or you're looking to get that assessment. So Steve and Rich, thank you so much.
Thank
And we
you so much.
appreciate we really appreciate everyone attending today. And again, continue to follow us on LinkedIn for any upcoming events that we have going on. But I am going to sign off, and you guys all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
All right, thanks,
Great
Steve.
day.